Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I truly appreciate it, and guess what? It's been a long time coming. A lot of you have been asking about it. It's time for a new episode of UFOs in Your Hometown. So I'm calling this one UFOs in Your Hometown, episode 14. This is part of my ongoing quest to prove that UFOs are being seen everywhere on this planet. I've explored about 150, almost 200 locations, still betting 100%, proving that there's UFO encounters pretty much in every location. So I've got 10 locations for you today, 10 towns and cities, and these include Wales, 2 towns in Wales, including Flintshire and Flintshire and Debighshire. Also, Baxter Springs, Kansas, Kerrville, Texas, DeRidder, Louisiana, Manitowoc, Wisconsin, Muscatine, Iowa, Methuen, Massachusetts, Tupelo, Mississippi, Wallingford, Connecticut, and Waukegan, Illinois. While these do take a lot of time and research, it's so much fun to find these little gems, these cases that really most people have not heard about. But it's amazing because they have been covered in local newspapers or appear in various databases of UFO organizations. The cases I've found for you today include the entire range of UFO encounters. So we have cases of simple sightings, close encounters of the first kind, quite a few cases of close encounters of the second kind, where UFOs affect the environment in some way. But of course, close encounters of the third kind, where people see humanoids of some kind, and of course the fourth kind as well, in which people are taken on board a craft. So those of you who are looking for humanoids will definitely find some in this episode. Also, all kinds of evidence, including landing traces and animal reactions, and electromagnetic effects and physiological effects, and even photographs. That's really one of the fun things about doing these kinds of episodes, is this evidence almost always turns up. So this is going to cover 10 locations. It's going to be a pretty long episode. I'm trying to get through this list. I have like 1,000 places to look up. So for those of you who are waiting for your town to be covered, please be patient. I'll try to get there. But again, this does take a lot of effort. So let's just get to our first location today, which is Flintshire and Debighshire. And this was requested by Carmen W. Again, this is in Wales. I found more than a dozen cases. Again, the full spectrum of encounters in this one, which is a lot for a fairly small town. So I really want to thank you, Carmen, for suggesting this location. Some of these cases are just so interesting, and I think have quite a bit to reveal about why ETs are here and how they behave. An early case of a classic flying disc occurred on the night of May 13, 1967, when a young man was driving in Wrexham, Debighshire, and saw a bright flash in the clouds. He immediately noticed an object rapidly approaching and then hovering silently about 180 feet above him. The light dimmed to reveal a disc-shaped craft, blue-gray on the top and dark-gray on the bottom. It quickly darted off, becoming bright again, where it was also viewed by a truck driver. The next one occurred one night in May 1970, when Fred Sheriff and his wife saw a cigar-shaped craft described as 2 saucers joined rim to rim. As Fred says, it was as if it was right on top of my car. They reportedly were able to photograph the object, though I could not find the photograph. Now here's an account of a brief but very intense UFO wave in Flintshire, and it appears in the spring 1974 issue of the Bufora Journal. It was early on the evening of October 10, 1970, when 3 separate neighbors noticed a saucer-shaped object circling around the BBC television mast. The first saucer was followed by 4 or 5 others, all of which went around the mast one by one and then shot off. It was clear to the witnesses that they were investigating the mast in some way. The discs seemed to have strange appendages on them. 2 days later, another separate witness saw two glowing orange-red objects approach the mast and dart away. And the next day, the same witness said her television picture went haywire, which she connects somehow to the prior night's sighting. But on October 15 at 7:40 p.m., one of the initial witnesses reported yet another sighting, which he described as, quote, an object like a huge saucer on its side. But this was again in the vicinity of this TV antenna. It was followed by a few other discs. They were so bright that it actually hurt his eyes to look at them, and following this, the sighting stopped. But all the witnesses agree that the discs seem to show a very special interest in this television antenna, which makes sense because we have a lot of cases where ETs are showing interest in our technology. This next case is quite brief, but it's a very compelling humanoid case which comes from researcher Margaret Fry. The witness, a woman from Halkin, Flintshire, says that in July of 1982, she saw what she first thought was a meteorite hurtling through the sky, and then it stopped over a neighbor's home, and she saw that it was actually a large round object, yellow in color, with two rings around it, and it was making a humming noise. And it was just over a year later, in November 1983, that she was awakened by a bright light shining into her bedroom, and outside her bedroom window, just 20 feet off the ground, a human-looking face was peering into her room. And suddenly the figure was in her room and disappeared shortly later. And this was just the beginning, she said, of regular contacts with what she believes are, quote, people from outer space. I have no more information on that case, but it certainly sounds interesting. And here's another. On January 3rd, 1986, an incident involving a UFO investigating a TV antenna again occurred at a farm in Badfari, Debighshire, when the Edwards family of 5 saw a disc with blue, red, green, and yellow lights hovering for, get this, over 1 hour just above the television reception mast on Moel Paro Mountain. A few hours later, a government officer known only as Miss J was driving along the A547 highway when she saw a red oval object descend and land among the trees, illuminating a wide area. And the next day, another witness, Miss P, said that she saw an oval-shaped object 40 feet wide hovering very low, actually between two pine trees. And unknown to her, her neighbors also saw what appears to be the same object a few hours later hovering over their farm's electric lines. The next case occurred in January of 1990 when Pat Coulson discovered 3 circles in a triangular formation on her 33-acre farm in the moors. Researcher Margaret Fry investigated the case and adds, quote, there have been some unusual sightings on the Debighshire moors, and in one case a farmer was chased to his door by a UFO. A really impressive sighting occurred on December 22nd, 1992, when 2 15-year-old boys were bicycling along the B5429 near Badfari when they saw a very bright flash of light which coalesced into the shape of a large blue triangle, which they said was about the size of 3 houses. It hovered 100 feet above the ground and had white sparks coming out from either side of the triangle. The next night, other witnesses saw it. Researchers speculate that the craft were traveling along ley lines, which are believed to converge in the area. On May 12, 1994, a security guard reported his sighting of a large craft hovering over a quarry. A month and a half later, a woman described her sighting of orange and red lights darting around over Badfari. These are all in the same area. A very impressive sighting of a solid craft occurred in November 1997 when nightclub owner David Foulds saw a massive top-shaped craft in a field. As he says, it was absolutely huge and shaped like a massive spinning top. It was covered with thousands of lights and lit up the whole area. I was so shocked the car almost left the road, but I thought I might be seeing things, so I drove on. Then I stopped and turned around and it was hovering over the creamery. Then it just disappeared. I still can't believe it. Always more cases, and this one's really interesting. On July 28, 1999, paraglider Noel Humphreys was paragliding near Badfari Shortly after landing on the edge of the town's golf course, he saw and photographed an unidentified flying object. It looked a bit like a disc. I quickly moved in to have a closer look. My camera was with me, so I took a picture. Now he wondered at first if it could be a model plane, but there was no noise coming from it. And he decided it couldn't be a trick played on him because his landing had been unplanned. And as Noel says, it looked like a UFO, and it looked as if it was hanging around the trees. I really can't explain what it was. I didn't feel scared, just puzzled as to what was going on. I didn't recognize it, and I was really intrigued by it because I've always been skeptical of UFOs. Here's a more recent case. Christmas Day, 2007, as Harry Hughes and his wife Pam were in the front yard of their home on Grays Road. You can see it here when they saw UFOs right above their home. As Harry says, I looked up and saw what looked like 5 bright orangey-red fireballs flying through the sky. They were traveling quite fast, about 10 to 12 seconds apart, and were revolving. They were traveling too fast to be aircraft and were completely silent. So he called out his wife, who also saw them. It turned out that several others also saw them too, including David Clark, who said that he also saw 3 bright lights, one of which actually separated from the others and flew straight up. As he says, at first we thought they were balloons or planes. They were going too fast and they didn't look like planes. There was no noise whatsoever and they were going so fast. I have never seen anything like that before. Another witness was Mrs. Coulson, who said, quote, it was coming towards us, then stopped and went backwards, stayed still for about 4 to 5 minutes, then darted away. It was really strange. We really don't know what it was. Marie Davis of Chester Road says, I couldn't believe my eyes. I would like to see it again. It was very weird. So this turned out to be one of many reports around that time, because just a few days later, on New Year's Day 2008, Mike Jones of Sitchton reported his sighting of 2 similar objects. As he says, it was about 1:10 a.m. And I saw 2 orange lights in the sky, both traveling at the same speed with no sound at all. Then they just disappeared. They definitely were not planes or helicopters. They were something strange. A few days later, on January 6, James Holmes, age 10, says that he was awakened by strange lights shining in through his bedroom window. His mother confirmed she also saw the strange lights, but she didn't think too much of it. Now, the newspaper, the Evening Leader, published articles about these sightings, which continued to bring in more reports from people all over the area, and all of the witnesses described orange lights moving very fast. And one gentleman reported seeing as many as 7 of these objects. And even as late as October of 2008, reports were coming in, including from the mayor of Flintshire, Terry Renshaw, who had a rare daylight sighting. As he says, it looked like a big, flexible aluminum pipe, and it was traveling very fast, with no sound. He took a picture of it, but when he developed the film, all he caught was clear blue sky. So I'll just close out the Flintshire and Debighshire Wales sightings by referring everyone to a full-length book, The Denbigh Lights by Gary Jones, which has many other incidents showing without a doubt that this area has been repeatedly visited by UFOs. Thank you very much, Carmen. I learned a lot about UFOs just from exploring what's going on in Flintshire and Debighshire. Really interesting. Some of these encounters were like, wow. Yeah, every case, I think, has something to teach us, and I definitely learned some stuff there. So now let's move on to our next location, which is Baxter Springs, Kansas. So this was suggested by On the Go Crow, and you did a pretty sneaky method for getting me to cover this case quickly, kind of betting me that you had me stumped. Nope, I found some cases for you. Not a lot, but 4 cases for a small town of less than 4,000 people, I think is pretty good, considering that the vast majority of people do not report anything. But yeah, I found some on the Go Crow, so I win the bet. I think you'll find it pretty interesting. I certainly hope so. At 6:45 a.m. in early December 1988, a woman was driving to Baxter Springs from Galena when she says she saw a bright light to the south and looking closer saw that it was actually an L-shaped gray craft, slightly larger than a small plane, perfectly smooth, with no windows. She said it moved in absolute silence, so she kept her eye on it, watching it until she reached her place of employment in Baxter, at which point this object flew north at low altitude over the city. So that's the first case I could find in Baxter Springs, but there are others. In early October 1989, a mini wave of sightings hit the area. Bruce Weaver told reporters, "I saw 3 of them just tonight. They were red and hovering over the ground." And there were a lot of witnesses. An employee at the local Fast Trip food store said, "Drive down any road where it's dark, you'll see them." Another witness was Jolita Ingersoss, and she says she saw these lights near Commerce. As she says, 2 of them came together. They were red and made a funny noise when they flew over my house. It sounded kind of like an airplane, but quiet. Ottawa County Deputy Ron Medor said, "We've had 8 or 10 sightings tonight. They've just been spotted all over the place." In fact, on the night of October 18, 1989, police in Cherokee County and Baxter Springs received a series of calls from local residents reporting UFOs. The calls began around 8 p.m., and Galena Police Chief Pat Collins, you can see him here, set out to see the lights himself, and saw them. He described seeing different colored objects, white, red, orange, all hovering and then moving off. Another witness was Baxter Springs Police Chief Jerry Norin. You can see him here. He said his office received only 1 call, but the witness said that they were able to capture a photograph of the objects, which unfortunately was not published. Another witness, Barbara Orender of Baxter Springs, says, and I quote, "I saw these 2 red lights in the sky. When we got back out there, the lights had turned blue. They just sat there and hovered for a while, and you could hear a whizzing sound coming from them. What I saw was not an airplane. They weren't that far away, and you could see them real well. When I first saw them, they were real close, and they just went around and around." Now, some people are skeptical that these lights could be planes or satellites, or actually spook lights, which are known to appear regularly not too far away in Joplin, Missouri. But many of the witnesses who saw this says, no way, these are not planes, satellites, or spook lights, but something much stranger. A final sighting occurred on December 13, 2011. The witness described seeing no less than 15 orange orbs floating in 4 separate groups in a kind of square formation. He said they made no sound. Several were floating alone across the sky. He estimated that they were about 1,000 feet high, not very high. And he wasn't alone. He was with 2 other people who also saw these strange objects. There you go, on the Go Crow. I told you I could find something, and I did. True, they're only sightings, but still, it proves my point that UFOs are ubiquitous. They are being seen everywhere. So now let's move to the next location, which is Kerrville, Texas. I want to thank you, Randy Terrell, for suggesting this location because I found quite a few cases. This is a fairly large area with about 25,000 people. I found 10 cases, some really high quality cases in this one, undeniably cases involving genuine UFOs, close encounters of the second kind, and so forth. So I think you'll find it pretty interesting. It's really a fascinating history of UFOs in this town, Kerrville, Texas. The first sighting to get any real publicity in Kerrville, Texas, occurred on January 9, 1953, and it's actually a close encounter of the second kind. Britt Lamb, an engineer at KEVT radio station, reported his sighting of a, quote, red-orange oval-shaped object which circled the city. And at the same time, he said that there was a very unusual interference, is how he put it, on the station's transmission. He described it as, quote, most weird, and said it was, quote, like heavy static with a roar that traveled up and down the scale. He absolutely attributes this radio interference to the appearance of this object. And there were other witnesses, including Ivan Young, age 13, and Edgar Rasmussen, age 14, who together saw this object approach Kerrville from the west and circle around the city and then disappear to the north. They said it was oval-shaped and had what looked to them like two fins on the rear that were shooting out red and green flames, quote, like lightning. They said it traveled, quote, much faster than a plane. And they also said that it gave off, quote, a buzzing, ringing noise. So a pretty interesting early sighting. 7 years later, October 9, 1960, at 8:05 p.m., 7 students reported their sighting of what they described as a pastel green luminous sphere. It moved from roughly north to south from horizon to horizon in about 5 seconds and had a very unusual kind of self-reflective or self-luminous color. So this report actually found its way to Project Blue Book, and per Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence J. Tacker, their conclusion was fireball. Hard to say for sure. At any rate, I don't really trust Blue Book. Now, here's another interesting little story about Kerrville from Whitley Strieber. It actually comes from his sister. And as Whitley Strieber writes, sometime in the early 1960s, she was driving between Kerrville and Comfort, Texas, well after midnight, and she was terrified to see a huge light sail down and cross the road in front of her. A few minutes later, an owl flew in front of the car. I have to wonder if that is not a screen memory, but my sister has no sense that it is. So those of you who might not know this, but owls are very closely associated with some UFO sightings and often thought to be a screen memory or some weird connection there. Next case occurred one evening in December 1968. A group of students and law enforcement officials observed an unknown object flashing red, green, and yellow lights. It traveled northeast of Kerrville at high altitude. Another case occurred roughly around that same time, 1968 to 1971, and was reported to MUFON in 2012, decades later. The sighting occurred as this witness stood outside his home one morning, facing south, waiting for his mother to take him to school. This is when he heard the sound of an engine of some kind, and looking up, saw a 60-foot cargo plane with its engine screaming at full throttle, coming towards him. As his house was on a hill overlooking a valley, this plane was actually just below his eye level, and as the witness says, it appeared to be pursued by 2 bullet-shaped objects. They changed position relative to the airplane as they zoomed overhead. One came from behind to above the plane, and the other from one side of the plane to in front, as if leading it. The objects were about 20 feet long, flat gray in color, with an orange tip and a flat orange band around the back end. They disappeared above and behind me over the top of the hill. So he's convinced that those were UFOs kind of tracking this plane. An astonishing sighting involved 3 witnesses and was reported to the National UFO Reporting Center. It occurred one evening in May of 1979. The reporting witness was 7 years old at the time, and he was with his mother as they drove to the grocery store. And as the witness says, as soon as we came out of the tree-covered road from our house, I spotted a gloriously beautiful, long, diamond-shaped craft right outside the car window. It was on the other side of the tree line from the road, but clearly visible. It resembled 2 cones with their bases put together. It was maybe the size of a grain silo in diameter, but it was covered with lights, with seemingly no rhyme or reason to the layout. The lights were different color and flashed in no pattern. So he tried to tell his mother, but she was clearly terrified, and in fact she was driving at 80 miles per hour, and told him to ignore this craft. Now this craft actually followed them into town, just yards away from their car for several miles, then hovered momentarily and winked out. Now when the witness tried to talk to his mother about it, she refused, and she said that it was just his imagination. And as he says, her reaction frightened me. But it was just 1 week later that the witness's older brother, age 10, came running very excited into the house and said that he and his friend were packing up their fishing gear when this giant craft, which he described in the same way, appeared and hovered overhead. He said it made no sound, but he could feel this faint buzzing in his body. He said this craft emitted a bright foggy light directly onto him and his friend that made them feel warm and tingly. Then suddenly it vanished. A pretty amazing encounter. An equally astonishing encounter occurred on March 3, 1980 to two women, Karen Styler, a high school chemistry teacher, and Elizabeth Barnes, a fourth grade teacher. So good witnesses. They were driving along the Highway 46 between San Marcos and Kerrville to attend a class. This is a route that they traveled regularly. But on the evening in question, they came over a hill and saw what they described as an intensely brilliant, rounded blue object. As soon as it came into view, it rose up from the ground, illuminated the treetops brilliantly, and darted off. And as Karen Styler says, "I have never seen anything before that I could not explain. There must be a reasonable explanation for this, but I cannot imagine what it could be." So there's no real information about this next sighting, other than it comes from the Department of Public Safety dispatcher who had a sighting of something unexplained over Kerrville in December of 1980. And he wrote in a public statement saying only, "I don't believe in little green men, but I'd like to know what it was." Now here's a really interesting encounter which was reported by Luke Liddell Fowler. He was a camp counselor for a camp located just outside of Kerrville. It was a clear summer night in 2007, 11 p.m., as he and two other camp counselors were outside when they all saw a strange craft moving among the stars. As Luke writes, "I immediately pointed out the craft to them, and they also immediately saw it. It was three white lights in the shape of a triangle moving slowly across the night sky. It seemed to be a very giant craft, possibly thousands of feet in diameter. It was blocking out stars as it moved across the sky." So it was pretty high up there. He estimates perhaps 100,000 feet in altitude. And after about 2 minutes, each light went off in sequence and the object disappeared from view. There was an interesting aftermath because 2 weeks later, one of the counselors was watching a UFO show on television and was startled to see a video from someone who said that they had filmed a UFO outside Kerrville, which turned to be around the same time as their sighting. So he's watching this video, and to his amazement, it showed the same object, or what appeared to be the same craft. Now here's a real recent case, which was reported to MUFON in 2019. A couple was standing outside their Kerrville home when they both noticed that they had been engulfed in a huge spotlight coming from above. And as the witness says, it wasn't a regular light. It looked almost like a bright blue high beam. It hovered over us slowly, and just when I looked up to see what it was, I noticed how huge a light it was, along with the circular shape it had. After a few seconds of me staring at it, it darted off to the west. As it moved off, the witness could just discern a kind of V formation, but the couple was left absolutely puzzled by this sighting and said that the circle of light was far too large to be a plane. There you go. Kerrville, Texas definitely has a history of encounters. And I keep saying it, every location on this planet has a history of encounters. It's amazing to me because that just means that there's got to be probably, hundreds of millions of encounters out there that really haven't been put into any worldwide organized database. What we have is all these scattered databases all over the world, and a good number of them have never even been put in these databases. Because I'm getting a lot of these cases from obscure little newspaper articles published in these tiny newspapers. So let's move to the next location. This one is also really interesting. This is DeRidder, Louisiana. This was requested by a couple of you, including Good John Jr. and Beauregard Paris. So thank you so much, guys, for suggesting this town. This is a pretty small town, some 10 to 15,000 people. So I didn't find a lot, just 4 cases. But I think these are all high quality cases. And in each of these locations, honestly, I have found more. but they're unexplained lights at night, somewhat ambiguous, and don't have a whole lot to teach us about UFOs. So I kind of just pass over those cases because while each case does have something to offer in terms of our understanding of this phenomena, I'm much more interested in cases that have a little bit more meat to them. So yeah, I found 4 for you today. Thank you, Good John Jr. and Beauregard Paris. I hope you find this interesting. On April 5, 1957, this was actually during the Levelland, Texas UFO wave, a huge wave of sightings, a gentleman in DeRidder, Louisiana, became concerned when the dogs in the living room began growling and the cows outside in the pasture began mooing excitedly. Looking outside, he saw a huge white light growing in intensity and pulsating in brilliance. It actually remained there for about 15 minutes and then disappeared, at which point the animals calmed down. So that's a good case of an animal reaction sighting. Apparently quite a few of these kinds of sightings in DeRidder. Because here's another one. January 4th, 2004 at 7:50 p.m., 3 witnesses saw what they described as a flying triangle with red lights on the points and white lights in the center hovering in the western sky. They said Air Force planes were flying around it, and at the time of their sighting, their dog was barking. So, a brief but interesting case. Here's another involving animal reactions, which occurred at 11 p.m. on April 5, 2018. The witness was at his farm when he noticed that the cows in the pasture across the street were mooing loudly. So he went to the large west-facing picture window in his living room, expecting to see coyotes or perhaps some other animals spooking the cows, and instead he saw something else. As he says, I observed a huge round white light traveling slowly towards my direction. The light became larger and brighter, then appeared to stop and began pulsating. This continued for 15 minutes. Then, like flicking off a light switch, it was gone. As soon as it disappeared, the cows quieted, and my dog stopped growling. I was very curious and tried to reason out what it could be. Now, the witness was puzzled that his own dogs weren't barking, and he says that this was not his first UFO sighting in this area. So yeah, we're only touching the tip of the iceberg here. One final case in DeRidder. On September 16, 2021, William Champagne posted a photograph of an object that he said flew directly over his house in DeRidder. I have no other information on this case, but it certainly is interesting because he photographed it. There you go. More proof that UFOs are being seen everywhere, including in DeRidder, Louisiana. Thank you, Good John Jr. and Beauregard Paris. Super interesting. Now let's move to the next location, which is Manitowoc, Wisconsin. This was requested by Opposite Pickle, so thank you, Opposite Pickle. I truly appreciate it. This was actually really interesting. I found only 4 cases, but each one of them was particularly fascinating, and one involves direct contact with apparently a humanoid. What's really interesting about Manitowoc is it does have this interesting history. It turns out that Sputnik crashed there, the Russian satellite, crashed there in 1962. It's also supposedly the birthplace of the ice cream sundae. It's not a huge town, some 35,000 people. Definitely not small. I was really expecting to find more cases there. And again, I did find a bunch of unexplained lights, but I like to present cases, again, that are more substantial and have something to teach us and are well verified or unusual in some way. But definitely, Manitowoc has a history of UFO encounters. So thank you, Opposite Pickle. I hope you find this interesting. Well, I could only find 4 cases in Manitowoc. They sure are interesting, especially this first one. The witnesses in this case are 2 nuns from the Holy Family Convent on Alverno Road in Manitowoc. You can see it here. They called the county sheriff's office to report their sighting. It was about 8:30 p.m. on April 12, 1958, and one of the sisters had heard on the radio that Sputnik 2 might be visible. She had seen it a few times and wanted to see it again, and looking out to the southwest, she saw a star-like object which suddenly disappeared, But meanwhile another object appeared, and she watched it as it seemed to drop gradually from the sky. After watching it for about 10 minutes, she called out another witness, and as the sister says, "As we watched, it seemed to hover over the ground, but not touch it. It seemed to be about 5 feet above the ground, then would flare up to a rather bright light, and then it would move around back and forth past one spot, but still the light was very bright." Now the other sister verifies this and says, "The white object seemed to be going back and forth, uncertain whether to land or not. It had the appearance of a bright ball of light. There seemed to be a protrusion which gave it a sort of cone shape, and also an outline of red. The object was seen at intervals. The red object was very small. I couldn't tell what shape. It fell in a very uneven and slow manner. It wasn't a bright light." So she went off to get a pair of binoculars, and as the first nun says, just as she left, the object flared up and seemed like it was going to explode. Different colors came from it. There were different shades of orange, blue, etc. It looked like it was going to burst into flames. By the time the sister came back, it had gone to a white light. So they continued watching this for a total of about 3 hours, at which point it appeared to have actually landed in the field. It was at this point that they called the sheriff's office. 2 deputies showed up shortly later, and they also viewed this object. They ventured out into the field to get a closer look, at which point this object disappeared. So this sighting was reported to Wright Field, and instead of showing any real interest in the sighting itself, they seemed far more concerned about public relations. As they wrote, "Aside from the obligation imposed upon the Air Force to resolve the sightings, the unquestionable reliability and integrity of the observers could be exploited to the adverse interests of the Air Force by UFO clubs and flying saucer proponents if brought to the attention of the general public. This is particularly true if it is shown that no further action was taken or found inconclusive on the part of the Air Force." So basically, to quell interest in the nuns' accounts, the Air Force debunked this sighting, and they said it was, quote, "the star Betelgeuse and Pollux," which is so ridiculous, but that's the Air Force for you. Now here's another interesting sighting in Manitowoc. It was at 1:45 a.m. on April 23, 1961, that Thomas Wisniewski, he was an employee for the Milwaukee Journal, described his sighting of a dull, gray, disc-like object. He said it was revolving and moving slowly from east to west over the city, and while this object was in view, he said he could hear it emitting a sound which he said was, quote, "like rushing wind." Another case occurred years later on March 21, 1994. There were several witnesses who called the police to report strange lights over the city. Detective Captain Roger Hartman took the calls and said that the witnesses' descriptions were very consistent. All described seeing airborne lights, white, blue, and red. He sent out deputies to investigate, but by that time the lights had disappeared. Calls to the Coast Guard revealed that they were not doing any military maneuvers, so ultimately these lights remain unexplained. Now this next case is a very interesting onboard UFO encounter, which was reported by the witness Tim Mufon, who says that on January 8, 2015, he had been suffering from a headache on the day prior to all this. Going to sleep, he woke up at about 2 a.m. to sense a presence in the room. And he said he felt strangely secure as a female voice telepathically instructed him to go outside. And as he says, "She made me feel calm." He was then instructed to look up, and when he did, he saw a luminous disc, which he said looked about 30 feet wide. It immediately descended silently to about 10 feet above the ground, and then he says he felt this kind of, quote, "energy," quote, like a magnet. It actually pulled him up into the craft at a 45-degree angle. He felt no pain or anything like that, no fear, just a very calm feeling. And as the witness says, "The next thing I remember is floating over my bed for a few seconds, then being placed back in it by 4 beings." He couldn't really see them well as the room was very dark. He was unable to move at this point, but he did notice that they had placed him sideways in the bed. And as he says, that bothered me. And as soon as I thought this, as though they were reading my thoughts, they immediately refloated me and straightened me out with the bed so my head was on the pillows, and I felt my covers being placed on me. Now at this point he did get a brief look at the figures and described them as, quote, short people in my room, just a dark gray silhouette about as tall as me. He woke up the next day to feel a strange itchiness in his hip, and examining it, he saw a V-shaped mark and a slight bruise. The witness says he does have a history of encounters, but as he says, this is my most vivid visit, and like the others, all have been good and very comforting. There you go, opposite pickle. Manitowoc definitely has UFO encounters, and definitely some really interesting ones as well. It's funny because most people don't report their encounters, and that's especially true if it involves humanoids or an onboard experience. So those are a lot more difficult to find in these locations. But I found one, which just goes to show that this is something that is very widespread. I keep saying it, but that's the whole point of this series, which was born from a challenge, basically, that I didn't know how well it was going to do. So I'm really impressed that I'm still able to find all these cases, which is thanks 100% to the people who've had these encounters and found the courage and strength to step forward in a very hostile climate of skepticism and fear and gaslighting and ridicule. So really, all the kudos go to the witnesses who have reported these encounters. Now let's move to the next location, which is Muscatine, Iowa. This was suggested by Elizabeth Mann, so thank you, Elizabeth. This was pretty interesting because I've found quite a few cases in this one. This town is famous for being visited by Mark Twain, and it's also got the interesting distinction of being the only town in the United States with that name. It's not a huge town, about 24,000 people, so kind of mid-sized, but I found quite a few really interesting cases. Definitely some interesting cases in Muscatine, Iowa. The first occurred on April 6, 1950, when a housewife described her sighting of an object that looked, quote, like a ball of fire from a Roman candle. She said it flew from the northwest to the southeast, disappearing into the distance and leaving what looked to her like a vapor trail behind it. Earlier that day, there were several other sightings of a UFO over Burlington and Reardon, which is only about 50 miles to the south, obviously not far as the UFO flies. Now here's a photograph from Dave Crook, admin for the Facebook group called Muscatine History and Memories. And he posted this UFO photograph, which was apparently taken on September 25, 1965, with the caption, UFO sighting in Muscatine, Iowa, size of a football field, with ice crystal-like lights on the bottom. In parentheses he wrote, I don't remember this, but this does appear to be an interesting photograph of a UFO at treetop level during the daytime, which is quite rare. Here's another pretty interesting case, 1969 to 1970 thereabouts. Don Williams, a towboat operator of Williams Marine Enterprises, was amazed to see a brilliant star-like object hovering over the Mississippi River. This is outside of Muscatine. He watched it for only a few minutes, watching it drop smaller objects and then disappear, but he was very much impressed that it was something unusual. And was even more impressed a few months later when he was down in Muscatine proper, and he saw it again. As he says, this time I hollered, hey Ollie, take a look at this. And I told him what was going to happen and didn't any more than get that out when blink, the lights started dropping. The brightness was about the same, like a fast parachute jumper, only this time I could see 4 lights in the sky at one time. We watched them all drop below the horizon in about 3 minutes. So, close encounter of the first kind, but definitely kind of interesting. Another case occurred on July 21st, 1981. The police received 3 separate calls from Muscatine residents reporting UFOs. The first came shortly after midnight when Randy Reynolds of 809 Poplar Street told police that he saw a, quote, large orange disc fly overhead, appearing to change in shape from a disc to a cone. This is probably a matter of perspective, but then something really interesting happened, another amazing sighting. This one is definitely a close encounter of the second kind. It was 3 hours later that Alan Wagner, a toll taker at the Norbert F. Beckley Bridge over the river, called the police to report his sighting of a large orange disc. He said that morning he was getting ready to feed the wild rabbits, as was his habit, and usually they flee from him. But this time he saw that this was so unusual, they were stretched out flat on the cement pavement, unmoving. And this is when he noticed this large orange disc hovering over the treetops on the far side of the river. He estimates it was about 30 feet in diameter, and in his case he said that this object, quote, made a whizzing sound as it flew off. The object was about 150 feet off the ground, 750 feet away from him, and as it moved, it cleared the highest part of the bridge by only 10 feet. So that's a pretty low altitude sighting, and interesting how it had this effect on these rabbits. A third person anonymously reported what was apparently the same orange craft moving over the river, and reportedly, police officers patrolling the area heard a strange, quote, whizzing sound, but did not see the object itself. Barbara Shute, a field investigator for the Center of UFO Studies, said, quote, it's the best sighting the center has had for a while. And she later learned that just before the sighting there was a power outage, though there does not appear to be a connection to the sighting, because according to city officials, the power outage was caused by a raccoon who got into the electrical equipment. But nevertheless, interesting. In November 1983, radio station KFMH in Muscatine did a very interesting kind of stunt. They decided that they were going to send out a midnight broadcast every Wednesday evening for 10 to 15 minutes, inviting aliens to come and visit the city. This was because of a number of recent sightings. And program director Steve Bridges says, we play a message of friendship and then play tapes of people who believe in them. We give our location in latitude and longitude in English, Samoan, French, Italian, Japanese, Malaysian, and other languages. Then we ask them to respond. So this was very popular, and in fact the station received so many calls from people interested in this message that they had to install a separate phone line. Unfortunately, while there was a response from the people, there was no apparent response from any ETs. Now here is another report from MUFON involving an apparent missing time encounter. It was 2 a.m. on November 28, 2021. The witness was riding his electric stand-up scooter near Weed Park when something very strange happened. As he says, I noticed something in the sky, like it was heading towards me. The next thing he knew, he was waking up on his couch with vague memories of being pulled on board. As the witness says, I'm absolutely scared, and this is not the first time. My witnesses are my roommates, who said I was gone when they went to bed, and they found me on the couch and do not know how I got in, because the alarm was still on and hadn't been reset by door entry. This is like the 5th time this has happened to me, and I have frequent deja vu episodes now. Like often, I can predict things. Nothing major, but it's hard to explain. Thank you, Elizabeth Mann, for suggesting this town of Muscatine, Iowa. Super interesting, pretty much having the full range of encounters as well. And always these places have something to teach us about the extraterrestrial presence on our planet. So let's move to the next location, which is Methuen, Massachusetts. This was suggested by Anthony Simone. I want to thank you very much. This is a pretty large town, 53,000 people. I found 7 cases of really high quality, including a very intriguing missing time encounter. And when I say 7 cases, in a town of 53,000 people, you can bet that there's easily closer to 10,000 cases probably. There are some studies that show that about 10 to 20% of people have a UFO encounter, which is probably a vastly underestimated number because, again, most people don't report it. So that's one of the reasons I am doing this research, and particularly this series as well, to show that UFO sightings are far more common than most people realize. So thank you, Anthony Simone. I hope you find this interesting. The first case that I could find in Methuen generated enormous interest from researchers, including Raymond Fowler, J. Allen Hynek, and James E. McDonald. It occurred to 3 teenage girls on the evening of January 20, 1967, and it's a classic case of a close encounter of the second kind. It was 6:30 p.m. as Kimberly Lodge, Ellen Kenny, and Janice Schaefer, all ages 16 to 17, were driving along Washington Street on their way to a basketball game. Janice was the first to notice a string of 9 to 10 bright glowing red lights hovering at low elevation over a field to the left, and they were discussing what it might be when Kim laughed and said, "It must be a UFO or a flying saucer." Now she was just joking, but suddenly it was no longer funny because looking at this object they could see it was hovering in place and spinning on its axis, shooting off different colors. It was definitely nothing conventional. Kimberly, who was driving, stopped the car, leaving the engine on, and they were arguing about whether to get out of the car when suddenly the car stalled, mysteriously. At the same time, the radio and the lights went off, and as Ellen says, then nobody wanted to get out of the car. Truthfully, I was too scared to carefully observe the object. She actually crouched down in the back seat. The driver, Kimberly, tried repeatedly to restart the car, but it would not work. This object was about 200 feet away at this point. They could now see it was roughly disc-shaped and clearly a metallic object, which they said looked to be about the size of a house. You can see their drawings here. They could see that the generator light on their dashboard did remain on, but was pulsating on and off, which was very strange. So they were stranded there next to this UFO for a full 2 minutes. And this is when the craft finally started moving, very slowly at first, and then zipped away, they said, at terrific speed. At this point, Kimberly was easily able to start the car. And it turned out they were not the only witnesses, because that same evening, about a half hour later, at 7 p.m., 3 other witnesses also saw what appears to be the same UFO. They were 3 miles away from where the girls were. Arthur, his daughter Nancy, and her friend Peggy were driving to the same basketball game along Lowell Street. This is very close to Washington Street, and this is when they noticed a pattern of red, blue, green, and yellow lights which looked to be hovering about 300 to 400 feet above the ground. Here's another multiple witness case which was very thoroughly investigated by Raymond Fowler. It occurred on February 17, 1967, when a sales representative was traveling along Route 93 near Methuen when he noticed an object of, quote, dazzling brilliance was hovering just above the road. So he slowed his car and could now see that this object had a bright green frame, is how he described it, a sort of rectangular display of very bright lights. And as he got closer, he could see a flashing red light. And he says this object had a sort of V-shaped appearance and was so large that it easily spanned the entire northbound lanes. It made no noise that he could hear, and he told Raymond Fowler that he became, quote, a little afraid of the thing. But he summoned his courage and kept driving, actually going directly beneath this object and moving onward. And he noticed several other people in their own cars also watching this unusual object. Now it was just about 45 minutes later that another witness, Kenneth Duval, an electrical engineer, and his wife were driving the same exact route when they saw what they described as, quote, a loose cluster of 8 to 9 red, green, and white lights at a low altitude and very slow speed. They did not think this was a plane or any conventional aircraft, and they watched it pass low over the road in a southwest to northeast direction. Now this next case has very little detail, but I thought it was an interesting report, which occurred at on February 10, 1979 at 5:15 a.m. The witness was observing an unexplained light that he said was changing from a star-like light to a glowing sphere and back about 4 times. And he says that he was then taken into the object and found himself back in his vehicle about 1 hour later. So I'm sure there's more to that case. It sounds like an onboard encounter. Unfortunately, I have no other details. This very interesting close encounter of the second kind occurred on August 13, 1988. It was very early morning when the witness heard a loud vibration and banging which shook the whole house for more than a few minutes. And thinking the boiler was about to explode, she ran into her father's room to warn him. He, of course, was already awake, and he realized that the sound was actually coming from above the house. So he ran outside and was shocked to see, quote, some type of unknown craft, large and dark, just above the tree line across the street and moving away slowly, very slowly. So the next day, they found strange evidence apparently related to this encounter. As they say, a large maple tree in front of the house had tiny broken limbs all over the ground under the tree. They were basketball-sized clusters on the ground. It was an abnormal sight. The strange thing was, the clusters were directly under the tree and not scattered about, which indicates a direct downward energy. Solid evidence that something went over the house, as the tree was taller than the house. They also found out that many people had called the police that night about a loud craft flying over the area. So apparently they weren't the only witnesses. Now here's another case which occurred just a few months later on December 11, 1988. The witness described his sighting of a massive object hovering directly over the Methuen Mall. She says it looked as big as a, quote, 3-story hotel. She called the Lawrence Eagle Tribune and reported to them because they had just published a UFO story the week before. And she reported it because, as she says, I would like to find out if somebody else saw it. I'm guessing somebody did, but again, most people don't report their encounters. Here is a final and very odd case involving missing time, which comes from a gentleman who says that on March 1st, 1988, he decided to take a nap before his 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. night shift at the local hotel in Methuen. Waking up from his nap, he was shocked to see it was 3 a.m., so he was 4 hours late for work, something which had never happened before. So he called his place of employment and said that he was coming in directly, and that's when he learned that it was now 3 a.m. Sunday morning. It had been Friday when he took this nap. As the witness says, I had 2 days of missing time. It took me several minutes to convince him that I was not joking, but I could not explain the missing 2 days. I lived alone and had never called out or been absent. How about that? 2 days of missing time. Oof. Makes you wonder what was going on during those 2 days, but it's certainly not unique. I mean, we all know Travis Walton was missing for 5 days. I'd like to do an episode about that, people who were missing for more than just a few hours, because there's quite a few cases of people who've had very long periods of missing time. So interesting. So thank you, Anthony Simone, for suggesting this location, Methuen, Massachusetts. I always learn something doing the research for these cases, and it's so much fun wondering if I'm going to find anything, and then finding it, proving my point that UFOs are being seen everywhere. So next location, this is Tupelo, Mississippi, which was suggested by Cedric Lunar. Thank you, Cedric. This was really interesting to me. I've been there. My father did a whole job there when he was working in the film industry, so I'm familiar with the town somewhat. Of course, it's best known perhaps as being the birthplace of Elvis Presley, who is himself a UFO contactee by all accounts, and had some experiences as a very young child. I didn't include those because I already covered that in my episode on celebrities who've seen UFOs. So if you want to check out Elvis's story, check that out, because definitely he has had some really amazing encounters. Tupelo is an interesting place. The name of the city comes from a Native American word meaning to scream or make a loud noise. I found that kind of amusing. This is a town of about 38,000 people, roughly, according to a recent census. And I found about 5 really high quality cases there. Again, I'm sure that's just the tip of the iceberg, but thank you, Cedric. I hope you find this interesting, because I know I sure did. The first case I could find in Tupelo occurred on July 2nd, 1947. This was only days before the famous Roswell, New Mexico UFO crash. The witness was Postmaster T.A. Morris, who said that at 6 p.m. he saw a silver, quote, flying saucer. He said it was flying at high altitude. There's no other information on this case, other than a few days later, a Mountain Home resident and his daughter reported seeing a similar object. The next really solid case I could find occurred in late 1973. This was during the time a massive wave was sweeping across the United States, with numerous reports of humanoids actually. The southeastern United States seemed to be the focus of most of the activity, but one particularly credible witness was Thomas E. Westmoreland. He was a National Park Service ranger in Tupelo, and he said that on October 3rd he observed a large UFO for a period of a full 15 minutes. As Thomas Westmoreland says, it was approximately 1,000 feet in altitude and roughly the size of a 2-bedroom house or a little smaller. It had red, green, and yellow flashing lights, not the standard beacon type you have on aircraft. They were circular and they were rotating continuously. Now he was not alone when he saw this craft, and in fact 3 other rangers and a deputy sheriff also observed the object. He's not quite ready to label this craft as extraterrestrial, and as he says, our theory is that it's some highly secret experimental aircraft the Air Force is trying out and doesn't want the public to know about. Now here is a particularly harrowing encounter which occurred to a couple. They had just left Prentice and around midnight on April 4, 1986 were heading north through Tupelo and towards Highway 30. Before they reached Highway 30, the wife saw what she described as, quote, a huge bright light. It appeared to be hovering over a large soybean field. Now her husband dismissed it as a combine, but as they pulled onto Highway 30 and started traveling westbound, they said this object began to pace their car from behind and to the right. And as the wife says, it was as large as a football field and had multiple bright lights surrounding the middle and a large dome and windows all around. As it followed them, the car radio started sputtering and the radio malfunctioned. The wife panicked and screamed at her husband to try to outrun the craft, and he told her that the gas pedal was pressed down to the floor. Despite this, the car would not go any faster than 20 miles per hour, and the engine continued to sputter. Now his mother lived just a half a mile ahead, so they kept driving, and several minutes later they pulled into her driveway, the car engine still sputtering, and as the wife says, I was in extreme panic, with my eyes on it the entire time. Then shifted up in the air in a blink, paused, and like a flash, it went north. So the object was gone, but the effects were long-lasting, because more than 25 years later they reported the sighting, and as the wife says, it has forever impacted my life, as I have a huge fear of traveling after dark. It made me think we were powerless. It was really the sheer size of this object that scared her the most. But she did later learn that her friend, who lived just a little further west along Highway 30, also saw this object just a few hours before sunrise on the same day that they had seen it. This next encounter was reported by the witness to NUFORC, the National UFO Reporting Center, a full 35 years after it occurred. The date was March 20, 1989, approximately. The witness was 18 years old and driving to the store, but weirdly, never made it. The next thing he knows, he's driving on a 2-lane road halfway home, on his way back home. He did have a vague memory of stopping at what he thought was a house or going inside a dark room of some sort. But now, finding himself in his car in a different location, he looks up and saw an egg-shaped object in the sky at low altitude. As he says, it was about 500 feet in front of my car and about 300 feet above the road. It made no sound and glowed like a very bright light bulb. It was so bright I could barely see through the light. It looked like a polished aluminum egg half the size of a house with a very bright glow all the way around it. He said it was visible only a few seconds when it darted off. And as he says, I have never seen anything move that fast again. Now here is a more recent and very unusual sighting which occurred around October 1st, 2003. It was 6 p.m. and the witness was walking his dog when he heard the sound of a jet. And looking up, he saw this jet and other jets approaching what looked to him like a massive glowing lenticular cloud. It was clear to him that the pilots were investigating this cloud-like object because they were approaching it and flying around it. Taking a closer look, the witness could see that this object was probably not a cloud because the edges were very defined and the color was this electric silver blue, an even color throughout the entire surface of this weird cloud-like object. So he watched this thing as it started to actually rotate and went from a horizontal to a vertical position in the space of about 30 seconds. So clearly not a cloud, because it then began to move in a straight line to the west. He could now see that it was about 6 times the length of the fighter jets, and it moved off steadily into the distance, taking about 20 minutes. And during this whole time, the fighter jets were flying back and forth around it, clearly very interested in whatever this object was. There you go, Cedric Lunar. Tupelo, Mississippi definitely has a history of UFO encounters and some really interesting ones. It's amazing to me that our governments are still waffling about whether or not ETs or UFOs are even real. They've certainly made steps towards disclosure, but when you hear cases like that last one of these fighter jets flying around this apparent UFO for that long, any dismissals of the subject are purely disingenuous. They've known for a very long time that there is an extraterrestrial presence on our planet, and that all of this is real. This cover-up is still in place. It's amazing to me. I think that's one of the reasons ETs are visiting everywhere on this planet, is to basically announce their presence. So let's move to the next location, which is Wallingford, Connecticut. This was suggested by Linda Tomasiello. So thank you very much, Linda. This one turned out to be particularly interesting. I found 7 cases, including a couple of direct contact onboard experiences. About 45,000 people live here. This is a pretty old town. It was established in 1667. Another little bit of interesting Wallingford history is that they had a witch trial back in 1697. That was the last witch trial in that state. But yeah, definitely a very interesting history of UFO encounters. So thank you, Linda. This should be interesting for you, I hope. And let's just get started. The first case I could find in Wallingford, Connecticut is actually an onboard encounter. The witness is Bob Luca. He's a well-known UFO contactee and was actually married to a well-known UFO contactee, Betty Andreasen. It was one of his early major encounters. He was 29 years old. It was one day around 11 a.m. in June of 1967 as he drove along Route 68 between Wallingford and Durham. This is again in Connecticut. He was heading for the beach when he saw 2 silver cigar-shaped objects. Suddenly, they each ejected a smaller craft which dropped down into the woods ahead of him. The next thing he knew, he was arriving at the beach 3 hours later than he should have arrived. So this puzzled him for a very long time. Finally, he went under hypnosis and recalled that one of these discs actually approached his car and shone down a red beam of light. His car stopped, and coming down in the beam of light was a gray alien wearing a sort of grayish-white metallic-looking jumpsuit. Bob Luca suddenly found himself inside the craft. He was floated, he said, into a 15 to 20 foot wide round room with metallic walls and a white glassy floor. He could see strange gauges and dials on one wall, a squarish dark cube with what looked like frozen lightning inside of it, and he was telepathically instructed to undress and lay out on a table. He said that 5 gray aliens proceeded to examine him using a metallic rod of some kind. A light came down from the ceiling and scanned his body. He said it was interesting because these ETs appeared to move in a sort of gliding motion. They reassured him repeatedly, telepathically, that he would not be harmed. He also heard them talking among themselves in a strange monotone language that he could not understand. Still under hypnosis, he recalled that one of the beings floated him back to his car, and he drove off to the beach with no conscious memory of the onboard segment. Now, finding out he was a contactee was very stressful for him. As he says, "For years, I didn't know what had happened. I never talked about it. I was worried about getting put into a mental institution." Now, here's another interesting case. June 4, 1972. 3 couples were returning from a late evening dinner in Wallingford when they saw a, quote, pear-shaped craft. They said it had a, quote, concave disc on the top and a red light on the bottom. And they watched it for about 15 minutes. All 6 witnesses were absolutely convinced that this object was not a plane or a balloon or anything conventional. So they decided to make a report to authorities, but their report was not taken seriously and officials just dismissed it, discounted it. Here's another case, 1976. An anonymous Wallingford resident was queried by a newspaper reporter writing a story about UFOs and asking whether he believed in UFOs. And the man answered that no, he did not. But he later learned that yes, UFOs are real, because it was 1 year later in 1977, he was in the Ridgeland section of Wallingford when he saw a, quote, domed disc high in the northern sky. And he watched it as it, quote, engaged in unusual wobbling, darting, looping, and drifting motions. He said it, quote, glowed in a brilliant, randomly pulsating white light with occasional bursts of prismatic color changing throughout its form. So this lasted a long time, a full 35 minutes, and this encounter marked the beginning, he says, of a series of contacts culminating in direct contact with extraterrestrial beings. Now, one Wallingford man who claims direct contact is John Belinsky. He may or may not be the man described in the above case. I think he is. I think he finally came forward because he says that in 1979 he had been repeatedly visited by gray-type aliens who appeared regularly in his home to take him on board their craft to examine him and, as he says, take biological samples. He was inspired by his experience to investigate the subject and eventually became a state director for MUFON. And as he says, you've got to be a certain kind of person to handle it. I'll tell you one thing, my life will never be normal. So he says that he was regularly visited by these beings. He's given one of them the name Zatar and describes him as being very tall, with a large head, pale skin, large, dark, shiny, angled eyes, and 4 fingers on each hand. He actually made a sculpture of him, as you can see. He has been told that more and more people will be visited, and as he says, they have always been around. They've been watching us for thousands of years. Now, he himself is a pilot, but he says that the technology achieved by the ETs is far in advance of our own. As he says, I have been shown a lot from them. If humans were able to understand it, we could tap into the energy of the universe. Next case occurred on March 21st, 1985, when the switchboards at the police and fire stations lit up when more than 36 people called to report a, quote, round thing in the sky. So some officials were skeptical, including Martin Small, a supervisor at the control tower at Tweed, and he says that what others were reporting was probably ultralight aircraft, which seems at odds, honestly, from the descriptions provided by the majority of witnesses. Of course, other officials disagree with the ultralight explanation. An official at Bradley International Airport in Windsor Locks said that if they were ultralights, they would not have been lit up as this object was, and that ultralights don't even usually fly at night. So this sighting was actually during a massive UFO wave known as the Hudson Valley UFO wave, which struck primarily the upstate New York area, but also parts of Connecticut. It remains a controversial wave to this day, and there has been a number of books on this particular wave of sightings. 2 years later, there was another very similar sighting, apparently still part of this wave. A musician and his friend were stepping out of his studio in Wallingford and looking up saw a, quote, large disc silently floating. Said it was directly over their heads at very low altitude, no higher than 1,000 feet. And as he says, we watched it pass over us very slowly, maybe 20 miles an hour. This is just a guess, because once it passed, we decided to follow it. I followed it in my car for 20 minutes. When we got to Route 10, the craft had gained on us and went over a hill. So now that it was out of view, they just went ahead and performed their music gig in Camden. They shared their sighting with others, and they were dismissed as crazy. The next morning, several newspapers published a story that 13 people were flying ultralights to apparently hoax a UFO sighting. The musician disagrees vehemently with this theory. As he says, this was not the case. I was directly under the ship and I saw its shape. It was constant. No fluctuations. It was also completely silent. 13 ultralights would have sounded like 13 people were cutting their lawns above us. There was no sound. I knew this immediately was a cover story, not a very good one. Now I did find another amazing onboard experience in Wallingford. It was so cool that I am going to save it for another episode featuring only onboard encounters. Thank you, Linda Tomasiello. Definitely Wallingford delivered, and I'm sorry that I didn't cover that last case of an onboard experience, but it was so interesting that I wanted to save it for an episode that's exclusively devoted to onboard UFO encounters. So I hope to get that one out to you over the next couple of weeks at least, but those cases are much harder to vet as well, and they're not as numerous as sightings and cases of humanoids and this sort of thing. So I'll get to it. But thank you. That was really, really interesting. So now let's get to our last and final location in this episode 14 of UFOs in Your Hometown, and that is Waukegan, Illinois. This one is really special to me because I grew up right in that area. I originally come from the Chicago area, Wauconda in Illinois, but this is right next door to it. I've been in this area before. I'm not super familiar with it because we did leave when I was quite a young kid. But yeah, it was really special. So really want to thank you, Ricky Daniels, for suggesting this location of Waukegan, Illinois. Definitely found some good cases, about 4, including a very unusual humanoid encounter. I'm sure there are a lot more because there's about 90,000 people who live in this location. So there's got to be thousands of sightings. But I think you'll find these particularly interesting. The first case I found in Waukegan is particularly compelling because it comes from a very credible witness, Dr. John Robinson, a histopathologist at the Great Lakes Naval Medical Research Unit. He reported his case directly to the Air Technical Intelligence Command in Washington, D.C. And as he writes, on September 6, 1950, I was at Edison Court, Waukegan, Illinois, about 5:40 to 5:50 p.m. The day was perfectly clear, no clouds in the sky, with a slight south wind blowing. I saw an object in the sky over the northern part of Waukegan, which I have not been able to identify. It was sausage-shaped, measuring 80 feet in diameter and perhaps 15 to 20 feet in center thickness. When first seen, was possibly 5,000 to 7,000 feet north at a 75-degree angle. It was nearly stationary, but had a motion of rotation end over end about a central axis. The object was clearly visible, was entirely silent. The outer or convex part was of a silvery color with a peculiar light appearance different from sun reflection and suggestive of luminescence. The concave or underside was of a light gray color. My first thought was that it must be a peculiar large balloon-like object, but I wondered at its large size, constant speed of rotation, and strangely bright appearance. It hovered in nearly one location for about 2 to 3 minutes and then abruptly traveled westward very rapidly towards the airport, with a speed I would judge to be that of jet planes occasionally seen here. It continued to be perfectly silent and also maintained its continual slow rotation about its central axis. When it reached a position 2 to 3 miles south of Waukegan Airport, it again slowed down and became nearly motionless. At this point a friend of mine arrived and I pointed this object out to him, which was equally puzzling to him. After remaining rather localized for a few minutes, it again began a very fast westerly movement and in a few seconds rapidly passed beyond sight. When last seen, it had a remarkably fast speed, which might have been several hundred miles per hour, faster than any aircraft I have seen. Now, as illustrated by confidential documents from the U.S. Air Force Intelligence, declassified 35 years after the sighting, the military intelligence officers took great interest in this sighting. Another very interesting case occurred around 3 a.m. on March 27, 1958. Paul J. Terrian of 918 Glen Flora Avenue was driving north on Route 42A just south of Route 120 in Waukegan when he saw a flash of amber light appear in front of him, right in the path of his automobile. As the light flashed out, the motor on his car mysteriously died. He coasted almost a block before his engine finally restarted, and he said he was, quote, all shook up. In fact, he immediately pulled over at a nearby tavern and alerted the police. The police retraced his route, but did not see anything unusual. Another really interesting case occurred on March 23, 1981, when Nancy Bryson, age 41, and her friend and roommate Myrtle Fulcher of 3216 Gideon Avenue were driving south on Lewis Avenue at 8:45 a.m. This is less than 1 mile from their home, and this is when they noticed 5 very bright, large red lights flying at a very low elevation, treetop level, right over the intersection of 33rd Street and Galilee Avenue, which you can see here. So they were so struck by this, they called the police to report their sighting, telling them that the lights were, quote, too big and bright to be airplanes. They weren't flashing on and off as airplane lights do. So while the police did take the report, they neglected to do any investigation. Final interesting Waukegan case involves what appears to be direct face-to-face contact with some kind of reptilian entity. The anonymous witness says that about 3:15 a.m. on November 10, 2011, after sending out repeated mental messages for direct alien contact, he was taking out the trash and throwing it in the apartment's dumpster when he saw a, quote, a black hole getting larger in size. Now, this was directly in front of him. He immediately realized that his request for direct contact was about to be fulfilled, so he forced himself to remain calm while keeping up his mental guard to protect his sanity, is how he put it. And as the witness says, it looked like a bipedal being with arms and a humanoid form. Its skin was dark. It insisted on standing in the shade out of the security lights from the apartment building where I resided. It may have had a scaly or reptilian appearance of skin, hands, and feet. I could not remember if it had a tail. It was in the darkest zone of my parking lot and landscaped. It could have claws on the ends of its fingers, but I stood further back, as I was beginning to frighten myself, for its intentions were unknown to me. Now, the witness was interested in these kinds of things. He was familiar with David Icke's research into reptilians, and he realized at this point that he was probably encountering one. And being alone, he got scared and realized that he might not be brave enough for such an encounter, so he retreated back towards the door of his apartment. And he says at this point that the entity, quote, moved in a way that a feline would after its prey. So he rushed back into his apartment and just meditated to calm down, and not long after that, moved out of that apartment to another building. A pretty interesting case of what appears to be a close encounter of the 5th kind, and also a close encounter of the 3rd kind, a direct contact with a humanoid. Thank you very much, Ricky Daniels, for suggesting Waukegan, Illinois. That was particularly interesting to me, having grown up in that area. But again, this just proves my point that UFOs are being seen everywhere. Again, this series of episodes was born from a challenge. Name any town, any city, any location on this planet, and I will find a UFO encounter there. And I'm still batting 100%. I know there's a bunch of you out there who are waiting very patiently for your hometown to be covered. And please be patient. I will get there. It's taking me a long time because some of these place names are quite common. And I have to go through thousands upon thousands of documents to try to get this information. But the implications of this are really profound. Why are UFOs being seen everywhere on this planet? I think what this shows is a couple of things. One, that UFOs are far, far more common than people realize in terms of UFO sightings and encounters. If they're being seen everywhere, just think how many cases there actually are. Again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. With most people not even reporting their encounters, there must be millions upon millions, 100 million encounters at least. I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if it numbers in the billion, actually. Another really interesting takeaway, I think, from the fact that these UFOs are being seen everywhere is that it looks like these ETs, and I do think that's what we're dealing with here, are putting on what amounts to a publicity campaign, a very carefully orchestrated publicity campaign, much in the manner of perhaps a musician going from city to city to play their music and get it well known, or an author on a book tour, or something along those lines. So I think this shows one of the ET agendas, which is simply to announce their presence. So that are the two main takeaways, I think, from this series of episodes that I'm doing, UFOs in Your Hometown, episode 14. Gonna get to episode 15 as soon as I can. I've been trying to do one per month, but this one was a long time coming because it's getting hard. Again, these take me probably 3 or 4 times the amount of work compared to a normal episode. So again, please be patient. If you'd like to suggest another location, I'm perfectly happy to put it on my list, just as long as you recognize that my list is now just under 1,000 locations. So I'll get to it when I can. Thank you guys so much. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, perhaps learned a little bit. I truly appreciate you guys watching. I think this is such an important subject. We all deserve to know the truth. It's time for this cover-up to end, and each of these cases has something to teach us about life beyond Earth. And what could be more interesting than that? So thank you, thank you, thank you. I truly appreciate it. I'll see you next week. And until then, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. Most important of all, keep having fun. Bye for now.